To regular listeners of Classic 107, the Eybler String Quartet will be a very familiar ensemble. The recordings of the string quartets of Leopold Eybler, Johann Baptist von Hall, and Haydn are played here at the station on a very regular basis. A few months ago, the Eybler Quartet released their latest recording, a 2-disc set of the string quartets of the Austrian composer Franz Asplmayr. If you've never heard of Asplmayr, you're not alone. I hadn't heard of him either until the Eyblers sent me this wonderful 2-CD set. It is with great pleasure that I have the opportunity to talk all things Asplmayr with the Eybler Quartet's violist, Patrick Jordan, and the first violinist of the Eybler Quartet, Julia Wedman. They've joined me here today over Zoom. Hello, Patrick and Julia. It's so great to see you. And I first want to say how much I really enjoy this latest recording of Asplmayr's quartets. It's just been a real treat to listen to.
Well, thanks, Chris. It's nice to be here with you today.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, very, very nice to meet you and also to meet another Asplmayr fan.
Yes. I thought I'd start, first of all, by just talking about the Eybler Quartet. How did the quartet come about?
Well, I don't know if Pat actually remembers this, but how I think the Eybler came about is Pat and I were driving in a car to a gig one day. And, as you do on these long car rides to gigs, you just start talking about, you know, life and how things are going. And he said to me, Julie, if there's one thing that you feel like is missing in your musical life, what would it be? And I had a very quick answer. And I said, I really would like to play string quartets on period instruments. Because at that point, I was playing in Tafelmusik, the Baroque Orchestra in Toronto, and I had a small Baroque ensemble, Ifiriosi, and I was playing in a modern string quartet with people who had an affinity towards period performance, but we weren't playing specifically on period instruments, and I really wanted to. I felt like that was something missing in my life, was just being able to go very deep into the music of the classical era with period instruments.
Right.
And lo and behold, I don't know how much later that was. I don't know, maybe like 6 months later or something like that. I got I think a call or email or call from Pat saying, "I've got a project. What do you think? What do you think about recording these Eybler quartets? I had these quartets in my library for a long time, and I've always wanted to play them and record them. I think they're really good. And what do you think about putting a quartet together and recording these pieces, and who would we get for it?" And so, of course, for cello, we wanted Pat's wife, Margaret, who's a wonderful cellist, and for the other violinists, what I would call my soulmate of the violin, Aislinn Noske. I said, well, we have to have Aislinn for sure. and and so we actually the quartet started as a project, not a quartet. And if you know anything about string quartets, you'll know that the form of the quartet can be very fraught, and it's a sort of like, if you start a string quartet, it feels like you're starting a marriage, which is it's really long-term commitment,
Right.
because it takes so much to really get to know each other so well, and you're so tied to each other in the performance of the music. Everything one person does affects everybody else. And I personally had several experiences with quartets that didn't go well. I think most string players do. So Pat was like, let's start as a project. We'll see how it goes. And actually, I think for the first few years, we were just a project. Is that right? Isn't that right, Pat?
Well, we had to put a name on the disc, right? We had to say
That's right.
so that was the moment where we used the Q word, I think.
Yes, but I think in person we didn't use the Q word for a couple of years. So anyway, so we played a few concerts and made this recording of the Eybler string quartets because we thought they were wonderful and wanted people to be able to hear them. And then sort of one thing led to another, and projects started piling up, and eventually we realized we could like each other for a long term. And so we became a quartet. Yeah.
That's great. One of the things I love about the Eybler Quartet, aside from the excellent playing on the recordings, is that it seems that you want to tackle composers that are sort of off the beaten track. Was this a conscious mandate made by the group? Like once you got forward decided that you were going to start the quartet, was it sort of a mandate to explore the off the beaten path literature?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people, especially in that classical era, I think a lot of people think the only three composers that were writing music in that era were Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. But there are all these other amazing composers who are writing music and nobody knows about. And we found that when we started looking into these composers, it gave us such a different understanding of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, who we also love and who we play lots and record as well. And I think I would say that we have two mandates in the quartet. And one is to bring to life this music that nobody knows and it has been forgotten or lost. And number two, to especially for recording, our recording mandate is to record things that we feel like we have something very different to say about that his is in the literature already. So for example, the Beethoven Opus 18 recording that we did a few years ago, we had started working on Beethoven's suggested tempo markings, which he suggested quite a few years after the quartets were written. And we started kind of working on his suggestions on a lark and realized that they really transformed our understanding of the music and just even how the music sounds. And so that was important to us to bring that, something like that
Were the were
out
the were the
to
tempo
life.
markings, sorry, were the tempo markings faster or slower than you used to hearing?
Different.
Yes.
Different.
Faster
Both.
and slower. Yeah, you often the quick movements are faster. It's sometimes a lot faster. And it's difficult. Like it's really difficult. You have to work at it. And I think a lot of people, especially with some of those fast movements, they just say, "Oh, well, that's impossible. You can't do it. It can't be done." And
Kind of throw in the towel. Yeah.
they just throw in the
Right.
too early. And
Yeah.
we were like, we're gonna do it, we're gonna keep at it until it becomes come and we had our metronome out a lot and saying, you know and kicking our own butts to really get the tempo marks up to where they should be, and also slower. And it was a real challenge in some of the movements, like I think 18-2, the slow movement, is one of the really, really slow ones. Also, 18-6 slow movement is incredibly slow.
So you're
And it
talking
takes
Opus 18, number two, Opus
Opus
18.
18.
Right? Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
Beethoven Opus 18, number 6 and number 2.
yeah.
Yeah, those slow movements are take such an amount of patience, especially when you're first playing them. Like I would get this, uncomfortable feeling in my stomach and my heart. I can't play this slow. I feel uncomfortable doing it. And you have to really, really force, it's almost like you have to force your inner pulse to calm down in order to be able to play those. So the Opus 18 was a great example
Mm.
for us of how Beethoven really meant what he was talking about, because the tempo marking in the first movement and the second movement are the same number. So the first movement, is it 80, Pat?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Opus 18, number 6, the pulse that Beethoven gives you for each of those movements is the same. So in the first movement, it's a whole bar gets an 80, and in the second movement, it's in 2/4. You get a 16th note gets 80. So
Oh,
it's same pulse, but the meter is radically different, right? So
right.
And another feature of those metronome marks, a thing that we discovered only sort of accidentally in it, is that when, for example, you play one of these contrasting, we call them slow movements. Sometimes they're marked slow, sometimes they're not. But especially these slow ones that are marked adagio or variations of that, they take up a bigger proportion of the piece. They become sort of a centerpiece to the movement or to the whole four movement piece in a way that they aren't if you play them too quickly and then play the other movements slowly, so that the sort of the proportions of time in the pieces get a little bit mucked up.
Right, right. Okay, so I have to ask the question, who discovered the music of Franz Asplmayr? Who's
Uh,
responsible?
who's the nerd? Yeah, that's right. That would be me. I have a huge database of 18th century composers that need our attention. And it's long, and it's cross-reference with where they lived and when they lived and who they studied with and all this stuff. And Franz Aspelmeyer's is a name that I had come across probably in the late 1990s in the first instance. In and the first instance of his name was when he was the first violinist at the premiere, it was a private concert for the Duke Paul of Russia. He was the first violinist. He's the guy that Haydn picked to play that music. And I was like, oh, okay, well, he must have been significant to Haydn in some respect. Aspelmeyer put that
To
one
play
on.
the Opus 33s, right? The Haydn.
Thank
Right.
you very much. Yes, that
Which
was.
which the Eybler Quartet has also recorded and recorded very well. I mean,
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, indeed. We have also recorded those. Another six, another two CD set of amazing music. But he then just sort of was on my list for a while. A few years later, I stumbled across in a used bookstore here in Toronto a a newly prepared score of string quartets by Aspelmeyer, Opus 2, by a fellow named Dennis Monk. And I thought, oh, Aspelmeyer, he's on my list. I'll just pick those up. We'll see. Um, and that I guess kept him afloat for a while. And then the Eybler Quartet started to be an Eybler Quartet, and we were looking for other repertoire. And Aspelmeyer, probably in 2009 or 10, we played uh, one of those Opus 2 quartets for the first time. Um, and there's a famous one of them that was republished in the early 20th century from this opus, Opus 2, number 2 in D major. And so there was a modern edition of it in the sense that, I mean, from about 100 years ago. So Aspelmeyer's name had not completely vanished, although it was pretty low below the radar. I dug up parts. We often play off of the original parts for these things, partly because uh, it means we're making editorial choices. Also, it's fun to realize this music off of a text that people in the 18th century would have had available to them. Often, when you get an edition of something, it's it people have looked at several different sources. Well, nobody who went and bought this music in 1769 would have several different sources to look at, right? I mean, there are manuscript copies of these Aspelmeyer, and we could have played off of those as easily as we played off of this first edition, but we chose the first edition in this case. So Aspelmeyer was a colleague of Haydn's, and he met him where Haydn got the job as Kapellmeister for Count Mortzin in 1759 or thereabouts, and that was kind of Haydn's first big break. He'd been kind of scuffling along, making a living for sure, working as an accompanist and composer in Vienna, and got this job. It was unfortunately a very short-lived job. It was only for a couple of years, and the count ran out of cash. But Aspelmeyer was one of the violinists in the band when he got there. So and they were friends from that time, from 1759 on.
But I was also reading in the liner notes. Apparently, he did a lot of theater music as well.
That's
But
right. Yeah, when the orchestra, when Count Mortzin's orchestra was disbanded, everybody went off on their own direction. Haydn got his next big job, which was as the assistant Kapellmeister for the Prince at Esterhazy, which was, of course, a life changing and totally transforming experience for Haydn. The rest of the orchestra kind of went off and had to fend for themselves. Asplmayr went to Vienna, and in a post that was recently vacated by Gluck, he began composing primarily ballet music for the Conservatoire Theater and other uh, instances. Dance was a big element of theater in Vienna in the 1760s and 1770s, sort of copied from the French operatic model. So Gluck was moving on and going off to make his fortune, and Asplmayr had that position for a while, but continued to work primarily in the theater and with dance. In fact, there are 11 complete ballets of his that are still existing out of about 23, I think, that were
Can I just
originally.
jump in here for one
yeah,
second
of course.
to emphasize the dance element, which is one of the things that we love the most about the Asplmayr quartets, are the his minuet movements, his dance movements, and it's sort of it's kind of like a litmus test for composers at that time in a certain way of like how like interesting and beautiful are the minuets because it's such a simple form, and the Asplmayr ones are quite short, and they can be very dull. These minuets in certain composers' hands, um, but the Asplmayr minuets are very beautiful and very touching and very different. Some of them are quite shocking, like the E major, the one in the E major quartet. For us,
Yeah,
almost sounds like Beethoven. It's got these really big extremes in it. So,
right, right. So on this two CD set, you've recorded all six of the Opus 2 quartets. I was reading in the liner notes that they were composed in and around 1769. What is it about the quartets that make them so unique? You were talking, Julia, about the minuets, but what else is it about these quartets that you found just fascinating recording?
Want to take that one, Julia?
um, well, yeah, I mean, I think one of the beautiful things about this music is that it's very simple. So it's not as formally experimental as somebody like Haydn or Mozart. The structures are they're very simple. It's concise. It's a little bit more like composers. How do you write classical music? And Von Hall, the composer like Von Hall, for example, who you mentioned earlier, who we've also recorded quartets by, his music is like the classic example of how do you write in this style. So
Right.
Aspelmeyer is a little bit more in that vein, but he is also a little bit experimental too. And I think we were attracted to the simplicity of the music, but also the kind of quirky, his little quirky things. And he also, his writing is quite touching, I think, especially in the slow movements. He has a very kind of heartfelt way of writing that was very attractive to us. But the fast movements are beautiful and light and fun, and the last movements can be quite funny and virtuosic and exciting. So it really had a lot in it, and his music actually almost every time we play it for classical musicians like other our colleagues,
Right, right.
it's often the Asplmayr quartet that people pick out of the whole program and say, "Oh, that was my favorite. That was my favorite
Mm.
one of the evening." Partly because it's a composer that people don't know, that is very attractive and very appealing.
One of
Yeah,
the things, sorry, one of the things I found fascinating about reading the liner notes is, Patrick, you were talking about how in the Asplmayr quartets, there's very often this sense that it's he's writing for three voices. You talked about how there's very often there's this trade-off between first and second violin. There's this sort of back and forth, and other examples like the viola doubling the cello part. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think there's let's let's put the cards on the table here. The Whatever attention Aspelmayr has gotten in the 230 odd years since 234 years since he died, um, has been pretty slighting. He has been slagged
Yeah,
as not interesting, as boring, for whoever has looked at it. Now, first of all, I do wonder about who's making those judgments and how they do it. I mean, if you're just looking at the first violin part of something for which a score doesn't exist, that's a little bit of a that's pretty quick judgment, I'd
yeah,
say. But I think we don't really know a whole lot about Ospelmeyer's early experience as a musician. His father was a dancing master, and so he probably learned how to write a pretty decent minuet from his father. But his compositional skill doesn't really fall into um, the standards of the day in a certain way. In that, if you were, for example, we were talking about Von Hall earlier. Um, Von Hall basically had his ticket paid by a noble who was about to engage him as a concertmaster, I mean, as a Kapellmeister, to go off to Italy and learn the new Italian style. Well, basically, that meant to learn how to write Italian opera and to learn, and the way people learned at that time was very much you sort of learn modules of how music gets put together. There's certain kinds of cadences. There are certain kinds of ways to build this kind of, and this is why a lot of classical music to some people from the outside sounds sort of the same, right? Because they're kind of working from, it's not quite cookie cutters because you're expected to be witty and to have a way of turning a phrase, but it is kind of assembled from certain kinds of parts. I don't think Ospelmayr ever had formal training of any particular depth in that respect, or especially early in his career. I think what he knew he picked up from the compositions around him. I'm sure the time that he spent with Haydn in the late 1750s, early 1760s was extremely valuable because Haydn, while he hadn't gone off to Italy, had worked as the accompanist and the for Niccolo Porpora, who was one of the great opera composers of the time, and Haydn himself says that is where he actually learned the art of composition. So I think there's so you could say therefore that Ospelmayr is not the best trained composer of his time, and I would not argue that point. What I would argue is that his particular personality is very well served by the tools that he had. So I mean, there are certain kinds of experiments. I mean, one of those pieces, the one in E major, for example, Opus 2, Number 4, has a single thematic element that is in every one of the movements. But that's before Haydn tried a thing like that. I mean, so
right.
it's not as if the guy wasn't working it out. But he didn't have the same kind of sophisticated skills. Now, mind you, I have this. I preface this whole thing by saying, "Who's the nerd here?" I have gone back and looked and done basically a statistical analysis of Haydn's quartets from around the same time, and he uses statistically not so different an approach to, for example, the viola and the cello parts being an octave apart or in unison, or one of the part, you know what I mean? So that it turns out to be three-part writing a lot of the time instead of four-part writing. And I think that people were figuring the string quartet was not even the string quartet yet. People were
It was a baby. Yeah,
It was a baby, and people were figuring out how to raise the baby, and that was a pretty common solution in the early days for the baby. Boccherini's an interesting case because he didn't do that so much. He stands out from that 1750s and 60s period as somebody who, because I was astonished when I started looking at it to see how frequently Boccherini has a real texture of four different parts. But anyway, so
So, and that sort of takes me to the next question. Julia, as first violinist for the Eybler Quartet, how is the violin writing between first and second violin? Is it fairly equal? Is it one of these situations where the first violin is highly virtuosic and the second one is sort of there to harmonize at times and accompany? How is the violin writing for Asplmayr?
Yeah, well, I will just preface this by saying Aislinn and I actually switch off playing first violin. So it just depends on which project we're doing, and we choose by composer.
Right.
So I play Aspelmeyer and Von Hall and Mozart, for example, and she plays Haydn and Beethoven and Dittersdorf, for example. um, but so I think in a way this is the other kind of interesting thing about the violin writings. We're moving from the trio sonata violin writing, in which both the first and second parts are a lot more equal. It's really often a conversation between the two violins, and then we're moving from that kind of form into something that is more conversational in many ways between the four parts, which is the later, as the quartet develops, that it becomes this four-way conversation, I would say. So Aspelmeyer is definitely a lot more first violin dominant, but there are definitely many places that still have this conversational element between the first and the second violin. There are a couple of pieces that actually Aislinn starts the piece with the main thematic material, and then I answer later. But definitely, my part is more dominant, especially in slow movements, things like a kind of aria, like an aria of a singer or something like that. And the second violin role is kind of in and out of melodic material and supporting role, as it is in the later quartets as well, definitely by other composers. But it's quite fun as to play first violin in these pieces. I'm not sure how fun it is to play some of the supporting roles. Pat, you could maybe speak to
well,
that.
we there are composers and there are styles of music. Um, there's sort of even at that time a sort of terminology started to emerge for that, but we call it sometimes the pips, right? Somebody's got to be Gladys Knight, and then the three
Right.
of us,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? The other three are the pips, right? And sometimes sometimes I mean in Haydn there's also especially in Opus 33 in the earlier quartets there's often an arioso sort of feeling to a slow movement. So Julie talks down the pips, but she's done plenty of pipping
I
herself.
yeah, I quite like being a pip as well.
Very good.
I love that. That's great. So, do we know what other chamber music did he compose? Do you know of any or?
I do, yeah. I have recently typeset another set of six quartets of his that were published in 1765. They're called Opus 6, so a later opus number, but published. Or this publishing and uh, nomenclature and knowing when something was actually written as opposed to when it was published is that's a lot of work.
Right. Um,
Oh, I think Pat is frozen, but I'll just add that I don't know if your
Any
listeners know about this website that's called IMSLP.
the International Music Score Library Project. Yeah.
Yeah, if people are interested there is some Aspelmeyer chamber music, and I think there are a couple of symphonies on there. There's a bassoon duo, there's some wind piece, there's some string trios. There are a couple of not this opus of string quartets. I don't think. Pat, is this opus on
um,
it?
I can't remember.
I
I
don't
mean,
think so. I
if
think there's
it's
another opus
it
on
might
there.
be Opus 6 that's there, actually. And there are other sources for these things. I mean, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France has a digital, a huge digital project called Gallica that is also a source, which is where I found the
Hmm.
Opus two parts originally. But I've also recently uncovered some divertimenti by Asplmayr for two violas and bass, which are an interesting set. I think they may have been written for students. I'm not sure. They're quite simple, quite straight ahead. But there are
Right.
also a set of there's another set, as Julie was saying before. There's a set of trios for two violins. There are at least a dozen of those, and there are a dozen
Mm.
of the divertimenti for two violas as well. So.
And can I just say, especially for this music is really accessible for students or for amateurs or people, it's really music that you can imagine people were playing in their living rooms and having a wonderful evening of chamber music with their friends, having, a lovely time, like a little party kind of thing. It's not if you play the violin, it's not incredibly difficult to sight read and to get it together. I think this is like the Von Hall quartets that we play. It's music that at first is very accessible, and you think, oh, we're so great. Oh, we can play this music, no problem. And then the more you play it, the more difficult it becomes because then you start wanting to get every single corner exactly perfect and every chord has to be in tune, otherwise it doesn't sound good. And so it's I would say easy at first.
Well, and I mean, and what Julie's saying is true basically into the early part of the 19th century. I mean, this kind of chamber music was really meant for precisely that moment, right? Where you sit around with your friends and you play it. And you're amusing yourselves um, as much as you'd be amusing anyone else. I can assure you that neither Haydn nor Ospelmeyer nor Boccherini were in the 1750s and 60s thinking, oh, the string quartet's the next big thing. There are going to be professional string quartets everywhere. No, that's not what it was. Home entertainment.
Right. So I was on your website, and it's my understanding that you were planning on having a CD release, but then it got hung up because of the COVID-19 situation. Is that right?
Well, there was a Thursday, I think it was like March 12th or something like that. Like,
April 15th, I think, but yeah.
no, but just
Oh,
there was
oh,
like
that day. Oh,
there was this like it was like the black day that that every concert for the foreseeable future was canceled. And we had a conversation with the quartet because every other big organization had been canceling everything. And we said, we kind of held off canceling the Aspelmayr quartet day because we thought, oh, well, maybe, but yeah, but no, that had to
maybe
that
not.
that had to get ditched. So instead, um, we ended up making a kind of short documentary film, kind of
Oh,
about
wow.
the recording process, and with some interviews with the four of us. And actually, that was a very interesting experience and fun experience for us. One of my students was experimenting with video, and so I got her to make this little documentary for us. And it's actually quite nice to have that, and in a way, we're able to give access to more people. And I think this is one of the things that I've noticed with the local concerts kind of being shut down is that in a way music is now can be spread over a wider field of audience with all the digital content that people are putting out.
Right, right.
We
So,
had we did actually just to that when we did the recording sessions we where we were clever this time and captured some video of the recording sessions because it's hard to it would have been very difficult to generate something like that without the foresight to capture that.
right.
Yeah.
So what's next for the Eybler Quartet? Are there going to be any virtual projects? Are you planning another CD to record? What's coming up? You mentioned Dittersdorf quartets, perhaps, or
Well, we have um, the next thing in the pipeline is Opus 54 of Haydn. That's a set of three quartets. We often, with these projects, do something a better known and then a lesser known composer, and so it's kind of it's Haydn's turn. He's been in the queue for a while, and in fact, Asplmayr, I will confess, kind of got bumped a little bit ahead on that one. Um, but Haydn Opus 54 is the next thing. Um, we have begun exploring the chamber music quartets, and there's a fantastic quintet as well of a Peruvian composer from the early 19th century, um, Pedro Jimenez Abril Tirado,
wow.
um, whose works, I mean, there's a lot of sacred vocal music from Latin America that was composed even in the 17th century. But the value of instrumental music was quite low. And so we know that a fair amount was composed. I mean, people owned instruments and there was a tradition of that music there, but we don't have a lot of existing music, chamber music and orchestral music until well into the 19th century. And a friend of ours discovered this huge cache of Mr. Avril Terrado in Sucre in Bolivia, where he worked,
Oh,
and fantastic discovery. And the parts are so beautifully copied out. You just play right off the parts
off the
that
manuscript. Hmm.
right off the manuscript. Um, so that's another one. We also had our first a couple of years ago our first late Beethoven experience together, which was fantastic, and we're that's in the works. Um, and we were also in May intending to do a concert of earlier classical stuff with a music theorist colleague of ours named Susanna Clark, who's at Harvard University, to sort of one of the a concert of a sort of hear the music and take it apart and hear how it's put together in a different way. But I can tell you, if we did that on our own and I was blabbing into a microphone versus what will happen with Susanna Clark, this is like tricycle and Lamborghini. So, yeah, so the Lamborghini, we're gonna go for a ride in the Lamborghini sometime soon. We
Right.
hope. So,
So, in this COVID-19 environment, where can people get the Eybler Quartet's recordings? You-
oh well, if you like to listen to things online, it's available through all the major platforms: Apple Music, Spotify, Idagio, with the notable exception of Von Hall, I think. But if you'd like to order an actual physical copy of a CD, that can also be done either through CD Baby or right on our website, eyblerquartet.com.
And can I
And
also plug my new website? I also have a new website, juliawedman.com, that there is an Eybler page on it that has videos and links. And there's links also to the Eybler page where you can buy the CDs right on that. So that's like a kind of whole thing just on one page
and
on that.
perfect. And for our Classic 107 listeners, it's worth it to just buy the actual disc because of the liner notes. The liner notes provide a lot of, it's a wealth of information, especially for composers like Von Hall and Asplmayr and, some of these composers that are more off the beaten path. So
Yeah, that
Thank
well worth it.
well, that's a labor of love. And well, it's also it's fun to do. So
you.
Julie and Patrick, this has just been a real treat. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me and uncovering the music of Franz Asplmayr. I'll be looking forward to a time when I can see the group perform live here in person in Winnipeg, or perhaps
Yes.
your next recording project.
Look forward to that very much.
Mhm.
Certainly are. Thank you so much, and thanks to all the listeners at Classical 107 too, who support what we do.
Yeah,
Yes, thank you very much to everybody.
the recordings are great, and I enjoy programming them. It's always fun.
Mhm.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.